What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the BLU F92e 5G and the BLU Bold N2. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about either phone individually, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the BLU F92e 5G, we're getting a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 270, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. With the BLU Bold N2, we're getting a 6.6-inch AMOLED display with a 1080p resolution, a PPI of 390, and a 19.5:9 aspect ratio. So between the two, for what they are, both phones do have good displays, but with the BLU Bold N2, in pretty much every way, first of all, it is quite a bit better than the BLU F92e 5G, and second of all, even for what it is in general, compared to other entry-level 5G phones like this, the BLU Bold N2 is definitely one of the better ones I've seen. The only real advantage the F92e 5G has, and this is kind of a small one, but with a 20:9 aspect ratio versus 19.5:9, it does have a slightly taller and more narrow form factor. Honestly, I seriously doubt you can even really tell the visual difference here, but if you're in landscape mode watching videos, for example, with the F92e 5G, you are going to get a slightly more immersive experience, and if you're doing something like browsing the web or using social media, you'll be able to fit a bit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. But honestly, again, the difference when it comes to that is really not that big. But on the other hand, with the BLU Bold N2, this phone does have several more major advantages. First of all, at 6.6 inches versus 6.5, despite the F92e 5G technically being a little bit larger just because the bezels are so much thicker, the BLU Bold N2 does have the larger screen between the two. And while the difference isn't really that noticeable, it is still something. So if you're going to be on your phone a bit more, it will make at least somewhat of a difference. And then with a 1080p resolution versus, again, only 720p with the F92e 5G, the BLU Bold N2 does have a much sharper and nicer looking image. So if you're doing stuff like watching videos, for example, where the image quality is a bit more important, you will get a better experience with the BLU Bold N2. And then with an AMOLED display, the colors are going to be a little bit brighter and more vivid. So again, if image quality is more important to you, the BLU Bold N2 will have a huge advantage, and it also does have much better viewing angles as well. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, the Bold N2 is going to be a lot easier to see. And if that wasn't enough, the BLU Bold N2 actually has a 120Hz refresh rate. Took a little bit longer than I'd like to admit to figure that out, but it does, and this is going to make the movement on the screen a bit faster and smoother, making the BLU Bold N2 feel a bit more premium in general. So overall, between the two, while the F92e 5G definitely doesn't have a bad display for what it is, if you do want the better display, the BLU Bold N2 is definitely it. Now, when it comes to storage, it's kind of interesting here because on one hand, the BLU F92e 5G has 128GB of internal storage, and it does have microSD card expansion, but the BLU Bold N2 has 256GB, but it doesn't have microSD card expansion. So this really depends on your priorities because on one hand, unless you have a 128GB microSD card, the BLU Bold N2 has a huge advantage in storage. But on the other hand, say you have a microSD card in your current phone and you don't want to have to go through the trouble of transferring all your stuff onto the internal storage of the BLU Bold N2, then in that case, the F92 5G is going to be a bit more convenient. And I know a lot of people just don't need that much storage. So if that's you, the F92 5G is going to be perfectly fine. And honestly, for this price range, 128GB is definitely still good. But in general, I feel like if you're someone who downloads a bunch of apps and games and stuff like that, you probably are going to be better off with the BLU Bold N2 because honestly, 256GB is a lot of storage. So even without microSD card expansion, you are still probably going to be better off. For security features, both phones do have face unlock and they both have fingerprint scanners. With the F92e 5G, it's on the power key, and with the BLU Bold N2, it's right here in the display. But starting with the F92e 5G, let's go ahead and give them a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And now for the BLU Bold N2. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive. No issues at all. And again, both phones do have face unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setups here. With the F92e 5G, we got a 13-megapixel selfie camera. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50-megapixel main camera, a 2-megapixel macro camera, and a 0.3-megapixel depth sensing camera. Now, technically on BLU's website, it does say this phone has an ultra-wide camera, but as you can see here, there's no 0.6x or anything. I'm assuming maybe they mean the normal camera frame is a bit wider, but compared to the BLU Bold N2, I don't really think that's the case, so I don't know what's going on here, maybe I'm just missing something, but again, as you can see, the normal way you would activate an ultra-wide camera doesn't look like it actually has the feature, whereas with the BLU Bold N2, in addition to the 16-megapixel selfie camera, and a 64-megapixel main camera, a 2-megapixel macro camera, and a 2-megapixel depth sensing camera on the back, this phone also does have a 5-megapixel ultra-wide camera, and as you can see in the camera app, it does have 0.6x, and it does get quite a bit wider than anything on the BLU F92e 5G. So definitely keep in mind, if you do like to get those wider angle photos between the two, the BLU Bold N2 will have an advantage. That being said, when it comes to everything else, I feel like these cameras are really similar. For photo quality, the BLU Bold N2 is maybe a little bit better, but in general, for everyday practical use, you're not really going to see a significant difference. That being said though, both phones do take really good photos, so if you do like to take nice photos for something like social media for example, you're really not going to go wrong with either device. To give you an idea of what they can do, first, here's some pictures taken with the BLU F92e 5G. Again, for what it is, it definitely does take some real nice photos. So if you are looking for something more affordable, this still does have a good quality camera, then you're really not going to go wrong with this phone. And then here's some pictures taken with the BLU Bold N2. Again, same thing. This phone does take some real nice photos. I feel like it's kind of debatable which one is better. In the grand scheme of things, I feel like they're pretty much about the same level, but the BLU Bold N2 has maybe a tiny bit higher quality, but I'm going to leave the specifics up to you to decide. The bottom line here is, if you are looking for a phone that can take some real nice photos, then you don't have to spend $1,000 on a flagship phone. For the normal things most people usually use smartphone cameras for, I would say either of these phones will get the job done just fine. Now when it comes to the RAM and processor, with the BLU F92e 5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. With the BLU Bold N2, this phone has 8GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 810. So in general, between the two, in my experience, the BLU Bold N2 is maybe a tiny bit faster, but honestly, you're not really going to see a significant performance difference between the two. It's not really that big. So overall, if you are looking for a more mid-range kind of device, for more basic activities like web browsing, social media, watching videos, whether it's on YouTube or a streaming platform, and then maybe playing some games here and there, for that kind of activity, as long as you're not going to be on your phone like all day doing stuff like super high performance gaming, for most situations, either phone is going to get the job done just fine. That being said though, again, with the BLU Bold N2, with the extra RAM and just having a slightly faster processor, if you're going to be on your phone a bit more, you might want to go with this one just because the experience is going to be probably a bit smoother. Now I did run benchmark tests on these phones using Geekbench 5 and here are the results I got. So again, not really a huge difference, but as you can see, the BLU Bold N2 is maybe a bit faster, not by much though. So again, these phones are really in the same kind of ballpark. So if you are looking for an entry-level 5G phone with decent performance, then you're not going to go wrong with either one. And yeah, just in case you didn't realize, despite not having 5G in the name, the BLU Bold N2 is a 5G phone too, so keep that in mind as well. When it comes to the battery, with the BLU F92e 5G, we're getting a 5000 mAh battery that supports 10W fast charging, and with the BLU Bold N2, we're getting a 4200 mAh battery that supports 30W fast charging. So between the two, if you want the better charging speeds, the BLU Bold N2 will have an advantage, but if you want better battery life and longevity, then the BLU F92e 5G will be better. But in general, neither phone has a bad battery, and in my experience, despite only having a 4200 mAh battery, which I guess isn't really small per se, but I feel like every phone in this price range is going to have a 5000 mAh battery, so it's kind of a disadvantage for the BLU Bold N2, but still in my experience, the battery life is really not bad. So if you don't really care that much about it, then this phone is still going to be perfectly fine. But if you are in a situation where it's a bit more important to have a longer battery life, then in that case, the F92e 5G is probably going to be a better choice. As far as the software goes, neither phone has Android 13, and unfortunately, knowing BLU's software support, I seriously doubt they're going to get it. But that being said, the BLU F92e 5G does have Android 12, which I want to say most phones in this price range at this point in 2023 do anyway. But the BLU Bold N2 does have Android 11, which is starting to get a little outdated. So if you do care about the software, then the BLU F92e 5G will have an advantage. In addition to this, unfortunately neither phone has NFC, so if you like to use tap and pay, you are going to have to get something else entirely. And speaking of other features, one thing I do want to point out is that unfortunately the BLU Bold N2 does not have a headphone jack, kind of following in the footsteps of the Samsung Galaxy A series phones. But as you can see, the BLU F92e 5G does have one, so if you do want that feature, then definitely keep this in mind. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, for 3 different reasons, I personally would go with the BLU Bold N2 over the F92e 5G. The first reason being the display. Again, aside from the aspect ratio, which really isn't that big a difference anyway, the BLU Bold N2 has a much better display. It has an AMOLED, 1080p resolution, higher refresh rate, and in general, if you're consuming a lot of content, these things are going to make a huge difference. The second reason I would go with the BLU Bold N2 over the F92e 5G is the storage. Again, even though this phone doesn't have microSD card expansion, I feel like with 256GB, you really don't need it. I mean, I use a Samsung Galaxy S21 FE to record all the videos on this channel, and it doesn't have microSD card expansion either. And my S21 FE only has 128GB, and I still don't have any issues with storage. Same thing for my iPhone 13, that's my personal phone. So honestly, the average user probably doesn't need that much storage. So with 256GB, even without microSD card expansion, you're probably going to be fine. But again, the only real situation where I feel like you might actually really want microSD card expansion is if maybe you have all your information on a microSD card anyway. Then in that kind of situation, yeah, transferring sharing something to the internal storage of another phone is probably going to be pretty inconvenient. So in that case, you might want to go with the F92e 5G, since again, this phone does have microSD card expansion. And honestly, if you don't really care that much about storage anyway, with 128 gigabytes, I mean, this is a $149 phone. So the storage on the F92e 5G is definitely impressive too. And then the final reason I would go with the BLU Bold N2 over the F92e 5G is the camera, because even though the photo quality isn't really that different, this phone does have an ultra-wide camera, even though I guess technically, allegedly, the F92e 5G is supposed to have an ultra-wide camera too. I just couldn't find it on this phone. So even if this phone does have like a secret ultra-wide camera that I'm somehow missing, the BLU Bold N2 has one that's regular and easy to use, so that automatically makes it better in my book. That being said though, again, the F92e 5G does have Android 12, whereas with only Android 11, the software on the BLU Bold N2 is getting kind of outdated. So if that is important to you, then you might want to go with the BLU F92e 5G instead. But in general, despite their differences, if you are looking for a really affordable 5G phone that has decent performance, a good camera, a nice display, a great battery, and a ton of storage, then you're really not going to go wrong with either phone. Now, once again, if you do want to learn more about either device individually, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.